What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jeremy Jackson Jr., John Morantz, Joe Johnson, Ja Raffs, of course. We've got Jays. We've got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
Locked in. MLB playoffs. WNBA finals start this weekend. About to get MLS playoffs and WSL playoffs. It's such a great time of year.
It is a great time of year.
And not because of football.
I will say that we're about we're 5 weeks away from my favorite time of year. Actually, that's not true. My favorite time of year is probably the sports we get from January 1st to the first Sunday in February. Because
really? Not April?
Well, if we're gonna include golf, I get like April's pretty spectacular too. But I would have combination, but like April as a whole is like fine.
It's an excellent week.
Now, if what happens in March happened in April, then fine. But like, it's really like a great 7 days. It's like It's Gym Nance week, right? That's what's great about April, right? It's the Final Four on Saturday. It's the national championship game on Monday. It's round one of the Masters on Thursday.
Yes. Yeah.
Hello, friends. But the first 4.5, 5 weeks of the year are. Right, the last week or so of the NFL regular season, then you get the playoffs. You get the college football semifinal. Well, not the semifinals. You get the college football. I guess you kind of get both, right? The semifinals are New Year's Six bowls, basically.
Yeah. You get all the important bowl games,
right? At least you get the national championship, and then you also get like the NBA season's kind of starting to gain steam.
Yep,
and you have the beginning of. You have conference play in college basketball. Yeah. So there is something on every single night that I want to watch perspective, January is pretty good.
I feel like I'm that my time for that. Definitely agree with you, but even more so now that I'm having to choose between things.
Right.
Because I get locked in now. Hockey's starting. Not that I'm a huge hockey person, but I get locked into the MLB playoffs. Just absolutely love it.
I will say I'm not super locked into the wild card. When we get to the divisional round,
we're there now.
Or are we there? Is everything done?
It was all sweeps. Nobody even had to play today. Yeah.
That's actually crazy. MLB is furious about the ticket sales. So I'll be locked in. Actually, we went to Camden Yards last weekend, saw the Red Sox play the Orioles. Baseball games that actually have full stadiums, I just never get to go to a baseball game that has a full stadium. It's just kind of like a walk in the park kind of feel and not like a sporting event. Anyways, so that's I'm looking forward to getting deeper into the baseball playoffs as well. This is a college basketball podcast. We're in the middle of our college basketball season preview, build up, run up, 12 plus podcasts. If you've missed any of our individual Just Josh and I previews of the Power 6 conferences, all of those are on our YouTube channel, all of those on our podcast feed. We are now in the midst of our revisiting of each conference alongside a guest. And I believe this is podcast number 3 of such podcasts. Is that correct?
4.
4? Who's the
sorry,
we've talked
Connor
to
and
Matt Majinski. We've talked to Matt Majinski about Kentucky and SEC basketball. We've talked to Connor Hope about the Pac-12, the last dance for the Pac-12.
You are correct.
And now
it's 3. Sorry.
We have arrived. He's getting ahead of himself.
Yep.
We have arrived at the ACC with our good friend of the pod and someone who the college basketball season cannot start until Brendan Marks from The Athletic comes on to the Jays for Days podcast. And that is what he has done on today's show. Brendan covers specifically the Duke Blue Devils and North Carolina Tar Heels for The Athletic, but he's also very well versed in the ACC as a whole and college basketball as a whole. It's always a blast to talk to Brendan, Josh, and today is no different.
Yeah, he's just absolutely fantastic. We know exactly what we're going to get. Always a great conversation and terrific insight from top to bottom in the conference, and somebody who is just so plugged into both Duke and North Carolina that I just feel like it's expertise you can't get very many other places in terms of how well he knows those programs and what is going on inside them.
It's always a treat. This really is one of the best podcasts of the year, every year, and we hope you enjoy. Without further ado, let's go talk to Brendan Marks about Duke, UNC, and the rest of the ACC. Joining us now for what feels like a annual tradition at this point is Brendan Marks from The Athletic, at Brendan R. Marks on Twitter. Brendan, thanks so much for hopping on again. Welcome back.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for letting this be an annual tradition. Very glad to be here.
You know what also seems to be an annual tradition at this point is this conference being dominated first, at least in the storylines, by the two teams that you are most closely paying attention to, and that's Duke and North Carolina. So we're going to start there because it feels right, and we'll start with the Duke Blue Devils this time around. This is the type of team that people gravitate towards, right? It's a team that has all conference player of the year type returning talent, and you couple that, guys like Jeremy Roach, like Kyle Filipowski, combined with high level recruits that jump off the page. Where are you in terms of how much you're looking forward to seeing this team on the court, how excited you are for this particular Duke team, and kind of where this Duke team stacks up in terms of the teams that have a lot of hype, other Duke teams that have had a lot of hype coming into the season?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think this is probably the most complete Duke team that I will have covered at The Athletic. I think that top to bottom, there are going to be guys in the 9th, 10th spots on this roster who would be starting for multiple other high majors in the country, multiple other teams in this conference. And they're not going to even sniff the floor for Duke just because that's how much talent there is. I think that obviously when you're able to bring back the caliber of guys that John Scheyer has, that's really rare at Duke. That has not traditionally happened, especially over the last decade. And so Scheyer has made it a clear point publicly to say, look, I want guys who are going to be around for multiple years. And the result is to have a team like this. So, I think in the backcourt, you have 2 5-star recruits, one of whom may start, neither of whom may start. The idea that 2 5-star backcourt recruits are coming to Duke and neither of them is going to start that's unheard of. In Kyle Filipowski, I think you have a guy who, even considering the fact that he's coming back from an off-season injury, an off-season procedure, I would be very surprised if he's not a preseason All-American. And then I think you've got a great mix of experience with guys like Jeremy Roach, guys like Ryan Young, guys who have been there and done that before. So, there aren't a ton of weaknesses on this team, maybe rim protection a little bit, but I would be very surprised if this is not a top 5, top 10 caliber team all year. And I think they have a really good chance to make it back to the second Final Four in 3 years.
How different do you feel like this team is than last year's? We talked to you last year about this idea that loaded recruiting class, those guys are going to be really important pieces. We saw that with Kyle Filipowski in particular. This season, as you just said, it's not like the recruiting is lacking, but it's a completely different role they're going to have because so many of these guys, whether it's the upperclassmen or some of those second-year players who were part of that recruiting class last year, they're coming back. It feels like a much more veteran-heavy team that isn't as reliant on those newcomers and specifically the freshmen. How different, when talking to people around the program, do you feel like this team is from that regard?
Substantially. I think a great sort of microcosm of a player that the situation we're talking about is Tyrese Proctor. So Tyrese Proctor last year reclassifies, comes in early after Trevor Keels decides he's going to stay in the draft. He's going to play a lot. He's going to play a lot early. Tons of hype in the preseason. I voted him as ACC Rookie of the Year based on what I'd heard in the preseason. And he finally got to be that player in the middle of February. He didn't start out that way. He couldn't really, I think he was shooting 9% from 3 after non-conference play. Now you're talking about a situation where guys like Jared McCain, Caleb Foster, they are capable of having a similar impact, I think, as like a Tyrese did last year, but they're not going to have to do it on the floor. They're going to be able to work through some of that stuff behind the scenes. They're going to be able to work through that stuff in more limited minutes. There's much less pressure on them to immediately be able to contribute because you do have this core, in theory. Duke can start all 4 starters from last year. Ryan Young, who was a part-time starter, like that is a viable starting lineup. And all of these 5-star freshmen, you got 4 of them. Not a single one of them needs to start. That is a legitimate option that John Scheyer has. So I think that in talking to people around the program, the expectations are a lot higher. Intensity has been a lot higher. And I think another thing that we're probably not getting enough credit to, and maybe we'll get into this more, is that, this is not a guy who's a first-year head coach anymore. He knows what it takes to get guys to that level. So I think top to bottom, roster, coaching, everything, there is a lot more sense of establishment than there was when you had a first-year coach with 11 new guys.
Let's get into that part of this. That this is year 2. Do you think we'll notice? Do you think we'll notice different things about the way that John Scheyer approaches this season? If so, where do you think those aspects will be specifically? But I mean, it was a pretty good start last year, and maybe just the thing that we'll notice is that he, like you said, that we're slowly turning it into John Scheyer's Duke program, not really a Coach K Duke program that is still kind of coming out of that era.
Yeah, I think that one thing we'll learn relatively early on, and I think I think this is already the case, but I think it will probably be publicly confirmed in the first couple of the weeks of the season, is I think John is really malleable. I think that he does a really good job of fitting what he wants to do around his pieces. So, like, for example, historically, the knock on Roy Williams was he needed to have the exact right pieces. He needed to have his rim running big. He needed to have his trailer. He needed to have floor spacers in the corners, and he needed to have a lightning quick point guard. And when he had all that, it was beautiful music. And when he didn't have that, you saw some of the cracks. I think that towards the end of his tenure, I don't think it's unfair to say that Coach Gay maybe got to be a little bit more like that. Wasn't necessarily as creative to fit his parts. And I think that John, just in what his roster looked like last year, like what you do defensively with Derek Lively is going to be a lot different than what you do if you've got Kyle Filipowski or Ryan Young as your starting center. So I think that he has shown already the ability to be more flexible. I think we'll continue to see that. The other thing that I think we'll see is I think that he will be, with that establishment, less timid. Not that he ever was, but like I'm expecting him to get a tech this year. He got close a couple of times last year, and there were a couple of times where it was like, come on, John. And I think that now he's more established. He knows how to operate a sideline. He knows how to work officials. He knows when to go in, when not to. He knows what to say. So I do think that we'll notice some of those changes. I think some of them will be subtle, but I do think that, exactly what you're saying, I 100% agree. It does not feel like a stewardship anymore, to me at least. It feels like this is pretty firmly his program, and there are clear differences. And those differences, at least in year 1, resulted in an ACC championship and a 10-game winning streak.
We all saw a lot of growth as the season went along, probably part because it was such a young team, and then obviously a big part of that also because it's a first-time head coach. What do you feel like Scheyer learned through the process of last season and just navigating a college basketball season that coming into year 2, either he's going to try and do some things differently? You mentioned maybe being a little bit less timid, even from just a preparation for the NCAA tournament standpoint. Are there things you feel like he's going to do differently now that he's been through this before?
I do. It's a good question. I think, for him last year, things went pretty poorly at the start. You had injuries to 2 of your top 3 recruits. You had guys in and out of the lineup. You had injuries. You had inconsistency. You had some really tough losses. I mean, that Purdue loss was like, a butt kicking out in Portland. And to see what he was able to do by the end of the year, to get to a situation where, Dariq Whitehead, I think the way he handled that was really informative. Like, you've got a top 5 guy who's clearly a first-round NBA talent. Okay, you try and work him back in. Maybe it's a little bit too much. Then he gets hurt again. Okay, now the rest of my team is clicking. How do I reinsert this talent but not upset the balance? And I think that, his decision at the end of the year to say, Derek, hey, sorry, like you're coming off the bench. Like, I think that takes some cojones to do that. Like, I think a lot of coaches, if they've got a 5-star, all world wing there, even one with the injury history Derek had by that point, like you're starting that guy and you're figuring it out. So I think that, I will be interested to see if John continues to have the creativity that he did at the end of last year. He was willing to move in January, February. He switched the roles for Tyrese and Jeremy, moved Jeremy into much more of an off-ball role. Proctor was much more on-ball, creating, initiating, and that was incredibly successful. Like those were not conventional ideas at the time that he's making them. And so I wonder if he doesn't have those same hurdles, will he have that same ingenuity? I think he will. But I do think that he sort of had to learn a lot through trial by fire last year, which probably was not super fun in the moment. But I do think that it was really informative for him in like structuring, like, okay, just because something is working doesn't mean that I shouldn't keep tinkering to make us even 1% better.
I think we see that a little bit actually in the construction of this roster as well. Cause I think in the way that college basketball works at this point, it's hard to get guys like Caleb Foster and Jared McCain and TJ Power to come to your program when in the same sentence you have to say, Jeremy Roach is a senior. Jeremy Roach has done this before. Tyrese Proctor was you last year, and now I know I can count on Tyrese Proctor, and the same with Mark Mitchell and Kyle Filipowski. So to, some of that, as you said, cojones to tell your Derek Whitehead that, listen, this is where, right, this season didn't go the way that I or you thought this was going to go. But here we are, and the way for you to help our team the most is to come off the bench. And maybe we get to February and it's Jeremy Roach and Kyle Filipowski and 3 new freshmen in the starting lineup. Like maybe that happens. And I would bet that Scheyer is willing to do that if that's what it demands. But you could also be coming off the bench all year, and to say that to a freshman and maybe he's worried about it, maybe he's not, that freshman is like, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere else where I know I'm going to get the ball. That being able to do that will ultimately, like you said, put his program into a place where they have sophomores and juniors and seniors. Speaking all that to say, we've got a lot of really fun freshmen here, and some that, while they might not be the foundation of the team right here on October 5th, when we're recording this, they could be in a couple months from now. So when it comes to these freshmen, which one are you most excited about? And then the second part, and maybe it's the same guy, maybe it's not, which guy has the most to do with Duke's success this season in terms of how important it is that he's good this year?
Yeah, well, I think the one that I'm most excited to see is Jared McCain. He has garnered a lot of praise this offseason at the various camps that he's been to away from the program. He's garnered praise from inside the program. He's garnered praise from NBA scouts and onlookers who have been through practices thus far. And just in having met the kid one time at Media Day, his personality is incredible. He's a true California guy. Very chill, but it's clear that as soon as he steps inside those lines, it's like a different dude. And guys who I think have the ability to turn it on and off like that, I think they tend to do well. But yeah, in terms of skill set, like Jared McCain could easily be the best shooter on this team as a true freshman. That would not surprise me whatsoever. If he is that person, Duke's going to need him to be. I think that he most likely is going to be a starter. If I was predicting the starting lineup right now, given everything I've heard, he would be the 5th starter. And if he ends up being the second best guard on the team by the end of the year, I wouldn't be surprised either. So I have very high hopes for him, and I know there's a lot of hype around him already. The other guy who I'm really interested in is TJ Power. We saw him at a brief portion of practice over the summer, and the dude did not miss. And he looked much more physically imposing than I expected. I think he's cooled off a little bit from that hot start based on what I've heard, but I think that he's a guy who gives Duke a lot of size that it doesn't necessarily have on the wing there. And I think he's another guy who can really shoot it. So I think McCain is the one who is the most guaranteed to me. I find it hard to believe he's not going to be a productive contributor this year in some capacity. But I think that Power, if he plays up to his potential, can really be a swing guy, even if it's not as a starter, just because of the size he provides, the passing, and obviously this was not a great Duke shooting team last year. So having another shooter, especially one who can truly be on the wing, not a third guard, I think that would be a huge asset as well.
Let's switch gears and go to North Carolina. First thing, we haven't actually talked to you since last season and everything that happened. In your mind, what went wrong? And do you feel like we are on the path to having those issues addressed heading into the season with some of the roster changes and just a clean slate to start with?
Yeah, as far as what went wrong, how long do you guys do these podcasts for? We could talk about that. I think it was kind of a perfect storm of everything going wrong. I think it was. I think you had a lot of guys who, for lack of a better term, got caught on their own, high on their own supply. They heard how good they were, and for a lot of those guys, they hadn't previously heard that in their college careers, and it was like, hey, we are pretty good. Look what we just did. And very much rested on their laurels. I don't know that all of the guys were in town practicing. I think they all had various engagements and were definitely doing stuff on their own, but that sense of team was lacking. I think you also had a lot of guys who were kind of entrenched in what they were, and there was only so much room for growth. I think that chemistry-wise, clearly you had some issues. But I would say I think I am probably more cautiously optimistic about North Carolina than the average college basketball reporter would be, I would say. I think that this can be a really good team this year. I think that they lost a lot of talent, obviously. I also think that they brought in a lot of talent. And I think that, that we got to talk about Caleb Love. I think that's addition by subtraction just in terms of fit. Caleb's a great player. He's probably got one of the most complicated North Carolina legacies of anyone I can think of. The shot he hit is a top 2, top 3 shot in program history. And I think you could probably make the argument that in terms of on-court play, he was the biggest individual driver for their faults last season. So yeah, I'm optimistic about North Carolina. I think they're going to have a much better year. I think that they can be a top 10, top 15 kind of team. I know that's lofty, but I think this offense has a lot of really good pieces. I think there's probably going to be more 90 to 80 games than 60 to 50 games. I think that they are going to score a lot and get scored on a lot. But I do think that overall, the talent is in a good place. The roster cohesion is in a much better place. And I think in terms of, that idea of a blank slate that you mentioned, Josh, I think that's so important. I think these are a lot of guys who either came from programs where they did not have success, or they were on this team last year and had to deal with the stink of the embarrassment that last season was. And I think a lot of them are really motivated now to be successful this year. So I'm high on North Carolina. I think that they could be a very surprising team in the ACC.
What do you think was the most, and maybe it's Caleb Love, and every chance I get, I will talk about how I'm not a huge fan of Caleb Love as a basketball player. I'm sure Caleb Love, the person, is, I don't know anything about Caleb Love, the person, but generally speaking, I'm not a fan of the archetype of Caleb Love, the basketball player. So maybe that would be where I would go first in terms of the most important or impactful thing that happened this offseason. Would you go to the same place, or would you kind of point into a different direction?
I think in terms of subtractions, I think he's certainly up there. At the end of the day, I agree with you. I think Caleb, in terms of the NBA eye, is an undersized 2 guard. And I think the thing that he never capitalized on at North Carolina, and I'm interested to see if he does at Arizona, is I think Caleb's a really good passer, and I don't think that he ever leaned into that. And I think that was a big reason why North Carolina's ball movement struggled so much last year. They posted the fewest assists in program history last year. So, that's, you had the second worst 3-point percentage and you had the fewest assists. And a lot of that is coming from the same dude, which is not great. So I think obviously that is a huge thing. And I think that those are the 2 areas that Hubert Davis identified and said, look, we were bad here. We have to be better. And the portal additions that they brought in were very targeted towards improving specifically those 2 areas. I think obviously Cormac Ryan he might be the guy who I think makes this all work the most. Like, I think Cormac Ryan is hugely important to North Carolina's success this year. He's going to have to be a floor spacer. He's going to have to defend wings. He's going to have to be, a critical piece for this team. And I think that he's shown that he can contribute to winning. The fact that he can move the ball and make plays without needing it in his hand constantly, especially when you have two ball dominant guards in RJ Davis and Elliot Cadeau, like, that's huge. I think that it's really important that North Carolina did bring in Cadeau. I think it's a gamble having a freshman guard. We know historically freshman point guards have struggled to adjust. I think that the hype for Elliott right now is probably a little outlandish. I've heard some people saying like, oh, he's going to average 8.5 assists a game this year. Like, 3 players in all of Division I basketball did that last year. I don't know that he's going to quite get to that mark, guys. Which is not to say that he's not going to be a good player, or be a one and done, or be impactful. I just think that, like, maybe we just let him sort of be what he is, which is a really, really good passer and somebody who's going to fix a lot of those ball movement issues. I think he's going to get open shots for guys. And then lastly, I think they bring in some other intriguing pieces. Harrison Ingram is obviously a huge name, McDonald's All-American. They're going to use him as like a point forward, 3-4. Paxton Wojcik, if he can shoot it against ACC caliber athletes, he will be an asset. And I've heard really good things about Jalen Withers too, in terms of his athleticism. I don't know that the 3-point production is going to carry over, but another body at the 4, North Carolina needed that last year. So I think the biggest thing is, you don't have a guy anymore who was at some points tanking your offense, and you've instead replaced him with, I think, guys who singularly don't have the ability to do that and therefore play more cohesively. And I think that's going to be a real benefit for this team in terms of the 2 things it was worst at last year.
I want to talk about Cadeau and build off of what you said, because that was one of the things we discussed on our ACC preview, is this idea that he's going to move the ball. He is very different than Caleb Love. And like you also mentioned, that's a lot of pressure to have on somebody who's never played college basketball before, never seen ACC opposition. And I just am super excited about him because I love his game, and I know he's getting all of the hype. How important do you think he ends up being for this team, and specifically in the sense of unlocking all of the 3-point shooters that got brought in, helping make sure Armando Bacot is effective as possible, because if he doesn't have the ball, there's only so much he can do. Just this idea that you're asking him to very much be a floor general and a decision maker, and try and, not repeat the assist issues of last season. Is he built to do this? And are we going to look at it and say he's the thing that makes this all work? Or do you think that's putting too much pressure on him?
I think that's too much. I don't think he's going to be that guy. I don't think he needs to be that guy. RJ Davis can be an All-American this year. RJ Davis, during the NCAA tournament 2 years ago, when North Carolina fully leaned into the RJ Davis point guard experiment, and they said, Caleb, focus on scoring. RJ, we want the ball in your hands. We want you bringing it up, everything. RJ Davis's assist numbers went to, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think he went to 6 assists a game on average during the tournament. He had that 10 assist game, I believe, was very much in control of the offense. You go and you look at the 3-point shooting, you go and look at the ball movement from those games. Like, RJ Davis can be that guy, and he's never had the opportunity singularly to be that guy because he came in the same class as Caleb Love, and they've been splitting the backcourt since they both came to Carolina. So I think that RJ Davis is in for a much bigger role. Of course, Cadeau is going to help. Whether that's starting alongside RJ or, coming in as the second point guard, like, the idea last year was that if you took the starters off the floor, which Hubert Davis didn't do very often, then things were going to fall apart. And this year, the idea that you can go and be like, hey, All-American point guard, take a 10-minute breather, 5-star point guard. Here you go. Best passer since Kendall Marshall. Come on in. We would love for you to play. Elliott is already making life easier for people based on what I've heard. He is getting those shooters open shots, which was not necessarily the case last year. So I think that is huge. But we got to understand that, like, RJ Davis is going to be the engine of this offense. Armando Bacot is going to be the engine of this offense. And if you think that, a reclassifying freshman point guard is going to come in and suddenly vault to the top of the totem pole, I think that is definitely expecting too much for him. Not that Cadeau's not a good player. I love his game. I just camped out at EYBL games and would be watching his passing. It was ludicrous. I love that he loves scoop alley-oops, and I hope that he gets a couple of those this year to Jalen Withers, because that feels like great poster opportunities. But I don't think that he necessarily has to be the guy, the singular engine for this offense from day one. I think that that's asking too much of him. I think it's asking too little of RJ Davis. And finding that balance over the course of the year, that's Hubert Davis's job, and I think that he will. But it wouldn't be a surprise to me for Cadeau to start. It wouldn't be a surprise for me if he does end up coming off the bench to start the year. But he's going to be heavily involved. I mean, he's one of the top 7 players on this team. He is going to be in the rotation heavily all year long.
Those things never go well either. I mean, in North Carolina's own program, I mean, Cole Anthony was really spectacular at the beginning of that season, but I don't think anybody would tell you they are going to remember that team fondly for forever. And even like the best freshman guard to ever like come in and completely dominate everything in the last 10 years or so was Trae Young. And that team ended like really like nothing special about how that Oklahoma season ended. It was just really awesome for like a month and a half. And then it was like, wait, this doesn't work against Big 12 opponents. And you're shocked to see that it didn't go super well. Are you concerned at all about, you mentioned Jalen Withers a little bit, of course, Wojcik comes in from a mid-major team. Do you think there's any way in which the 3-point shooting isn't there in the way that we're expecting it to be based on when you look at the stats from last year, that it's, oh my gosh, it's Jalen Withers. He shot 41% from the 3-point line last year. It's Wojcik. He shot, 38%, and Cormac Ryan's better than 34.4%. Are you worried about it translating at all?
With the only guy that I'm really worried about it translating with is Paxton, just because of the level of play from the Ivy League up. And if you look at his splits against high major teams, he was shocking, less efficient. Like, of course he was. He's playing against better teams. So I'm interested to see how much that carries over. But I will say this. RJ Davis shot like 36-ish% last year, I believe. 36 and change maybe. And he did that with a broken
36.2.
There you go.
There you go.
And he did that with a broken finger for half the year. So I think RJ Davis, as you can see, I am on the RJ Davis train, as I am very subtly alluding to. But I think RJ can be. I think he's going to be one of the guys. I think Cormac, like you said, I think he's better than 34%, especially when he's got a guy like Armando Bacot down low. He never had that in Notre Dame. I don't know that Jalen Withers is going to replicate the percentage or the number of successful threes that he made last year. Wojcik to me is really kind of the swing guy. Like if he can translate, like the staff has been very encouraged by him in what he's done, in their workouts thus far. But again, that's shooting drills. That's not against ACC competition. So, I think Cadeau is going to make a difference there. I think that he has worked a lot on his shot recently and has improved in that regard. He did over EYBL too. So, there are options here. I think there are. I don't think that this is going to be a top 10 3-point shooting team in the country. I don't think there's a Brady Manick on this team. But I do think that by and large, like this is a team that has enough that if you're shooting 35% from 3 as a team, that's more than enough. You can't be down in the 30, 31, the garbage range again. You have to be better than that. And I think they will be. If they're above 35%, I think that'd be great. But I mean, if you hit 35, to me, like you're probably in a pretty good place overall with this offense.
I want to run something by you that I ran by Josh in our preview, and I think is interesting. And I preface the following by saying that I'm not actually curious about Hubert Davis's job security. I don't think that's actually a thing. They could lose all of their games this year, and I think Hubert Davis would be the coach of UNC's next year. I mean, maybe that's a little extreme. That would be impressive, but you get my point. Is this a weirdly important year for Hubert Davis? And what I mean by that is on this, on the ground level, Hubert Davis had a disappointing year and a year he went to the Final Four. On the surface, that's one good year and one bad year. But if you break it into 4 halves, he has 3 pretty underwhelming halves and one where his backcourt caught fire. They figured it out for 2 months, and what they did was spectacular. is this like I think this is a important year for the psyche of North Carolina basketball under Hubert Davis. And not in a is he a good basketball coach at all way, but just in a it's easy to forget how this has actually gone when you went to a Final Four. And I'm curious if you think there's any merit to that, and kind of how you're feeling about Hubert Davis going into this season.
Yeah, when North Carolina hired him, never did I think Hubert Davis would be this polarizing. Never in my wildest dreams. I actually had this exact argument with a colleague last night, and he said that he didn't think Hubert was a very good basketball coach. And I said, I disagree. I think that Hubert is. I think that Hubert got dealt a hard situation. Like, let's not pretend that Hubert inherited a team that was like running people out of the gym. Yep. Like, Hubert inherited a team that lost in the first round of the tournament for the first time in Roy Williams' career. And the year before that was the worst season in the history of the modern era, other than, 2003, which we don't need to talk about. So he didn't exactly walk into a great situation. He also walked into a situation where he had very little roster construction power. He had so many guys already committed. And I think, the ability to go out, and even though he didn't necessarily go, 3 for 3 in the portal that first year, to get Brady Manick and to get what he got out of Brady Manick, you have to give him credit. You have to give him credit. I think he's really creative offensively. I think that he can do things offensively. I think that I agree with you. This is a big year for him, though, because now it is a lot more of his team. It's a lot more of guys that he brought in, and he's bringing them in clearly to play a certain style. He wants to space the floor. He wants to have better three-point shooting. I think that North Carolina could bring back some secondary break stuff, which they abandoned that first year, which helped them get to the Final Four. So, like, his willingness, we talked about malleability with Scheyer. Hubert's ability to go away from the Carolina style of basketball is what helped North Carolina get to the Final Four. Like, give the dude some credit for that. But, of course, there's a but. If they underperform this year, if they have chemistry issues this year, if they don't make the tournament this year, I think suddenly that seat gets really hot. Really, really, really hot. And Hubert's a really nice man. And like I just said, I think he's a good offensive coach. Defensively, I think the jury's probably still out. But I think that this year, I remember talking to administrators last February, March, before the season was officially over. And several of them saying, like, he needs his own guys. He's got them now. What does he do with them? And I think that this is, I don't think that it would take a lot for him to lose his job after this year. I don't think that that's the situation that's going to play out. Like I just said, I think North Carolina is a top 15 team. But certainly this is a prove it year for him in terms of, I think that comparatively, I think that John Scheyer has a lot more, like, it feels more like a John Scheyer program at Duke than it feels like a Hubert Davis program at North Carolina yet. And I think this is the year that could change. And if it does, I think that would be hugely beneficial for him. I think that sort of lays more of a groundwork. You've got good recruits coming in next year. If it doesn't happen, things suddenly look a lot more perilous.
So let's put these two teams in conversation real quick before we touch on some of the other teams in the ACC. Do you have them? You said you think North Carolina's got the potential to be top 10, top 15. Do you have them kind of in the same category? Do you feel like their ceilings are similar? Or do you feel like Duke is a class above and North Carolina would have to have a phenomenal season to keep pace?
Yeah, I think Duke is in a class of its own, just in terms of what they return. They have continuity. And like the only real question that I have about Duke this year is their defensive rim protection, especially. Like, I think that they have enough bodies that they'll be able to switch and be more aggressive defensively. I don't think they'll sit back as much as they do. I think they'll be more likely to turn teams over. But they don't have that rim protector. I mean, losing Derek Lively, like, there's no way you can look at that as anything but a gigantic loss. I would argue he was the best defensive player in the country by the end of last season. So I think Duke is Duke is number one to me, I think, pretty clearly. But I think North Carolina is pretty clearly too. And then after that, I think, is where the rest of the hierarchy comes in. I don't think it's a tremendous gap, but I do think there's a gap between those two. But I also think there's a gap after them. So I know we're going to talk about some of those teams. But yeah, I see it. I don't see it as like a 1A, 1B thing. I see it pretty clearly as 1 and 2. But I also see 1 and 2 as being pretty established as well.
So let's hop into the rest of the conference, kind of touch on some of these other teams. You mentioned, right, Duke and UNC kind of in tier 1, tier 2, and then maybe there's a next team there. It looks like that maybe the 2 teams that are poised for those types of challenges perhaps could be teams like Miami, teams like Virginia. So let's just kind of start in the broadly. If there is a team that's going to force Duke to, win 16 games to win this conference, not get away with losing that random Tuesday night game against a bad Boston College team that they always seem to lose. Where are those teams that you're looking at to kind of be that, hey, we're here, we can go 14-6, we could give you some pressure? Where are you looking first in the ACC this year?
The next 2 teams to me are Miami and Clemson. Miami, loses a lot from last year. Like losing Jordan Miller is tough. Losing Isaiah Wong, you're losing the ACC Player of the Year. That's tough. Like there's no other way around that. But you bring back really good guys too. You bring back Pack. You bring back Norchad. I think Wooga Poplar is in store for a step up. Fascinated to see what Matthew Cleveland looks like there. I think there's a lot of good pieces there. I think Jordan Miller is better than Matthew Cleveland, but I think that Cleveland can fill something of a similar role. And I think, quite frankly, if you look the past couple of years, Miami is one of the teams that's had Duke's number. They've turned Duke over. They've made the clutch shots that they've needed to make. And I think that same formula can work again. Like they have a ton of experience. They have so much experience. So, Miami a lot. Definitely they're up there for me. And I think Clemson is probably the team that I'm, really hitching my wagon to as far as like personal embarrassment and all of my ACC predictions. I think Clemson can be good. And like anytime anyone has said that, it's like, womp womp. Clemson has good players. I think Brad Brownell's a really good coach. I mean, you bring back PJ Hall, who I think is probably one of the 5 or 3 most underrated players in the league. You had Joe Girard come in, who again, what does he look like in a defensive system that's not zone? We'll see. We'll see.
At least he's still wearing orange.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. You don't have to get crazy with the Photoshops, right? So, and then I think Chase Hunter is really underrated. I think that Chase Hunter is a good player. I think Jack Clark, you get him from NC State. He's got league experience. Like I like those pieces a lot. So I think that Clemson can finish as a top 4 team in this league. And notably, I am not including Virginia in that mix. But I think that, after pretty clearly established Duke and North Carolina, Miami is a team that I think is going to cause problems for everybody. And I believe that Duke has to go to Miami this year. I might have that wrong, but I believe they do. I think in like the middle of February, late February. I think that's a game that I'm looking at as like that could be one that kind of has a really big factor in the regular conference standings. So those are my next 2. But I do think that top to bottom, the league is going to be a lot better this year. Like I think Virginia will be interesting. NC State will be interesting. Florida State, I don't really know what to expect. I think Georgia Tech will be better. I think that there's hope for the ACC yet. Let's not bury it just yet.
I said the same thing when we were doing an ACC preview about PJ Hall. As long as he's on their team, they got a shot. People just don't give him the love he deserves. I'm with you. You mentioned Clemson as one of these teams. Last season there was this whole group of teams that kind of came out of nowhere and had, at least for a while, really good seasons. Some of them tailed off at the end. Are you expecting, for example, a Pitt and those kind of teams to be able to follow it up? Or do you think we're going to get a very different ACC standings that maybe Clemson is kind of the only one that's able to replicate that?
I think that Pitt is going to be different. They lost a lot. Different talent this year. So I'd be surprised if Pitt was as good as they were last year. I mean, Capel did a hell of a job with them last year. Not that they can't be good. I just think that last year they were like a really tough physical team. I mean, they forced Duke to really lean into switching with Lively at the 5 because of their personnel. And I think that unlocked some stuff for Duke down the road. But I think there's some teams that could sneak up on people. I think Florida State could sneak up on people. I think their talent is interesting. I think, Leonard Hamilton was establishing Florida State as this power, and then the pandemic hit, and it felt like, all of the fairy dust disappeared. You go and you look at it, it's their defense that was making them in that caliber. They were never an offensive juggernaut, and the defensive efficiency has slipped year over year over year, and last year was the worst year yet. They also had some brutal injury luck last year, too. Bobby Miller was suspended last year. So I think Florida State could surprise people. I'm never going to bet against Steve Forbes making an all-ACC point guard out of a transfer portal find.
Yep.
He's done. Can he go 3 for 3? Sure thing. Hunter Salas, I think, could do that. The difference is like, what do they have in Efton Reed? Is Efton Reed able to play? Like the 2-time waiver thing is still kind of murky. But they haven't had a big that's that dominant since Steve Forbes has been there. Is Damari Monsanto healthy? At what point is he able to be a full go? I think Wake Forest could be a team that this might be the year they get over the hump. But obviously Steve Forbes also has some personal stuff going on. So with his wife, unfortunately, and I'm glad to hear she's making a recovery. So I think those are teams that could sneak up on people a little bit, and I would like to believe that, the teams that were at the bottom of the standings last year cannot be as historically inept as they were last season when we were wondering, like, is Louisville going to win a game? I don't think that Louisville is that bad this year. I hope.
On paper, right? I mean, there's talent. There's talent on that basketball team. What do you think ACC's like spot in the college basketball world is right now? I think this is super interesting because, I mean, for a long time, I mean, you look back, it's been like 15 years since they were the KenPom's best conference, which I know is like, it's one metric, but it's also one that we all pretty much universally respect. And you have to go back to 2019-20, the last time they were inside the top 5 at KenPom. Last year, they were 7th. The Mountain West was at KenPom, a better conference than the ACC last year.
Although, how'd that look in the tournament? Yeah.
I think because for a long time, right, it was, the Big East, it was the ACC, it was this kind of East Coast basketball, cathedral of these two conferences. And it's just, I'm curious. I like to ask people that cover this conference really closely because it just isn't really that anymore. It's behind the Big Ten. It's behind the Big 12. There are years that the Big East is, much better than this conference. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like losing 4 Hall of Fame coaches was tough. Almost like replacing Roy Williams, Coach K, Jim Boeheim, and Rick Pitino is hard.
Yeah. Imagine that.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like, listen, I don't think I'm breaking news here when I say that I think the ACC's days of being the premier basketball conference as we knew it in like the late 80s, the 90s, like, I think those days are probably done. This is a league that was built on basketball and then tried pivoting to football and is still trying to pivot to football because football is the thing that makes all the dollars move right now. And in the process, I think there definitely was something of a loss of identity. I used to cover my first job out of school. I was covering NASCAR. And one of the big things that I learned in covering NASCAR and why NASCAR went from, so incredibly popular in the early 2000s to the place that it's in today is NASCAR tried to go national. NASCAR left behind its regional roots and tried to expand and tried to be big and tried going to newer tracks. And sometimes know your role, stay in your lane. And I don't think the ACC necessarily did a great job of that historically. And now you are where you are. I will say this. I think that the ACC has an opportunity it has as good an opportunity to sort of microwave itself in terms of vaulting back up those standings because of the portal, because we do still have another 2 years of this COVID year. That hasn't cycled out yet. And so I do think it's easier to get better more quickly than it was in the old days. It's not like, you have to bring in 5 classes before you're starting to see progress. If you are bringing in 5 classes and haven't seen any progress, you're not bringing in that 5th class. You're not getting that opportunity. So I think that the league is obviously changing in terms of the guys who are in charge of the programs. I think that the ACC lost its way a little bit in terms of recognizing what was most important. But I think that you are starting to see some of these, like if I'm not saying John Scheyer is going to be Coach K. I think that's ridiculous. But like, if you have John Scheyer here in 5 years or in 10 years, like, okay, now you've got some longevity built up. If Hubert Davis is still here in 5 years, 7 years, you've got some longevity built up. I think you look around, like I think Mike Young, he's on the older side too. He's not old, but like you have him at Virginia Tech establishing some consistency. Tony Bennett is still there. Like it's not like the league is void of those guys. But certainly it's in a different place than it was. I don't know that it's ever going to get back to being that way, but there's no reason why the ACC should ever be the 7th best conference, especially in the era of roster overhaul that we're in now. It's not like these schools don't have NIL money. There's no reason the ACC should ever be as bad as it was. And so I think some of that is poor hires. I think some of it is poor recruiting, but I do think that, the ACC has an opportunity this year to start rebuilding its image a little bit. I still think that the Big 12 is the best conference in America. I think the Big East is up there as well, but like the ACC should be in that conversation at least. And I think that it probably won't be this year, but I think it'll rise back up the standings to, if it has a top 5 finish this year, I wouldn't be surprised. Like I think that that's within reasonable expectations. And if you're the ACC and you're the 3rd best power conference in terms of football, and you're outside of the top 5 in basketball, honey, we got problems. we got problems. I mean, like, I don't want to say this flippantly, but like the ACC is at a pretty critical juncture right now. You got maybe 7 years most to be solvent in the iteration of like status that you're in now. Like there are going to be teams that leave the ACC. That's happening. Like it's going to happen. Yeah. Not now, but it will happen. Like this is your opportunity to try to establish yourself as a staying power. You got 7 years, clock's ticking. Because after this current grant of rights deal expires, and if teams start leaving in 2030 or so, are you looking at a league where it's like Boston College, Georgia Tech, Cal, Stanford, SMU? Like, I want to gag thinking about that.
I'm thinking VCU.
Like, it's yucky. It's yucky. So, no disrespect to those programs, but like, sure. You this is the critical time. And this year, you've got to start reversing that narrative, or it's just going to get harder and harder.
2 programs that could kind of help do that we've touched on briefly that I want to dive into real quick before we let you go. Louisville, is there any hope? I look at this roster. You got 2 excellent transfers coming in. It's not like the talent is non-existent. There are players there that theoretically this should be a team that can, win some basketball games. Do you feel like there is some reason for optimism that it's not going to be a total train wreck again? And then also Syracuse, obviously beginning of a new era. Another team that you look at on paper, I mean, J.J. Starlight, Judah Mintz, Benny Williams, Naheem McLeod is not a bad place to start. I am really big on this Syracuse team. I think they could surprise some people. Are you on board with what this is potentially going to be, or do you think it's going to take some time to kind of another program that has a staple and now is going to have to reform an identity outside of Jim Boeheim's 2-3 zone?
I am on board with Cuse being decent this year. I don't know that they're a tournament team. I think they could be, because I think there are going to be some growing pains anytime you're going, away from a guy like Boeheim, like someone who's been that established. I mean, he's the most established of the established. Yeah. So I think there are going to be some growing pains there, but I think that I think Red Autry has like the right mindset going into it, just from having spent some time with him on the EYBL circuit this summer. I think he's in a good headspace of like what he wants to do. And yeah, I think like that backcourt on paper sounds pretty good to me. I think Benny Williams can be good. Yep. I think you finally have some big bodies. So I think Syracuse can be interesting this year. I really do. As for Louisville, I felt better when they had Trenton Flowers before he decided he wanted to try and be a point guard. That doesn't seem to be going too well. But I think it's hard to be worse than they were last year.
Yeah.
I think that Sky Clark is, they need Sky Clark to not have to be Ellis. Because if Sky Clark has to play that game, then we're right back where we were last year. But I do think that the roster is better. I think that Kenny Payne hopefully learned from some of his mistakes. I still don't know that they have great depth, especially in the backcourt. That's concerning. But can they be more competitive? I would hope so. I think he's probably got the hottest seat in the league right now. I really do. Like if they're not markedly better, I think, this could be a 2-year experiment. So a lot of pressure on those guys. A lot of pressure on that staff. I got a good friend on that staff, Nolan Smith. I'm hoping that they do well, but certainly, I think I had to do a mailbag question where somebody asked me, where did I have Louisville in the preseason in terms of rankings? I had them 13th, not last. I think they're going to be better than Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame is going to be tough to watch this year while they're building. But if they're not much better, then we're going to have a lot to talk about Louisville next offseason, including probably a coaching search.
It just doesn't.
It's unfathomable that program is bad.
Yeah. It was like threw you off guard, like just how bad they were. That we were actually having conversations about Louisville being like, when are they going to win a game?
Can they win? Yeah. Can they win a game? Correct. Yeah, right. that should never happen. Like, with the amount of resources in that town, the amount of resources of people have that care about that program like that. But it's up to the program to lean into that.
There you go. Brendan, this is a blast every single year, and we very much appreciate your time, and we once again appreciate it, and hope that the season goes well both in Durham and in Raleigh.
Yes, yeah, I appreciate you guys having me as always. This is a blast, and yeah, I'm excited to see if the ACC can pull itself up by the bootstraps a little bit.
Brendan Marks from The Athletic. Brendan, thanks so much. Brendan, thank you so much for taking the time once again to hop on the Jays for Days podcast. Josh, like we said before the conversation started, always a blast to hear what Brendan is excited about heading into an ACC season.
Yeah, it just feels like you can't set the stage for Duke and North Carolina without talking to him and getting a better feel for, especially in a year like this, how does Duke feel like John Scheyer is evolving into year two? I really appreciated the question you asked about Hubert Davis and Brendan's answer, talking specifically about how people inside the program feeling that he needs his own players, because that's something we addressed too, is there is no excuses. This falls at his feet for better or worse because this is the team that he selected. You can say that the Caleb Love, RJ Davis experiment was kind of forced upon him if you want to go to bat for Hubert Davis. You can't say that this time around because he is building a team the way he wants. I thought it was really interesting that Brendan made that point, that it still doesn't quite feel like it's his program the way that John Scheyer now feels like he has hold of Duke. And this very well might be the year to change if things go well for North Carolina and you can finally see what Hubert Davis wants this program to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was an absolute blast. And hopefully that this conference is more this year than just the conversation of Duke and UNC, and that we get some of those teams that made a step in the right direction last year, making even bigger steps in the right direction. Josh, we're halfway home on the interviews. Mm-hmm. Halfway home on the interviews. We have a couple more guests that are returning from last year that we're looking forward to, and we're getting ever so close to the college basketball season. Anything else before we get out of here?
No. Yeah. Thanks to Brendan as always. Always look forward to that one, and we're slowly getting there.
At Brendan R. Marks on Twitter. Always a pleasure to speak with him. Thank you to him, and thank you to you for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter and YouTube. Just search Jays for Days Pod. You will find us on both of or X, right?
Follow us on X. Just call it Twitter.
Follow us on X. You can find us there. You can find us on YouTube, and we are very close to the beginning of the college basketball season. We'll see you next week for more preview content. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. And we will see you later.